Okay, time for another deep dive. You've handed us quite a stack of source material today, all focus on one place, Montenegro.
Yeah, it's a lot. History, geography, culture, modern challenges. It's all in there.
And our mission really is to, cut through all of that, to pull up the most important insights, the fascinating bits, the details that genuinely help you understand what makes this small country tick.
Exactly. Think of this as your shortcut. We're going from ancient times right up to today. Mountains, coast, politics, identity, the whole picture.
It's definitely more than just a timeline. It's about understanding those layers of influence, that long struggle for identity, the spirit of the Black Mountain.
Well said. So let's get into it.
Right. So let's start with the basics from your sources. Where exactly is Montenegro and that name? Where does Black Mountain come from?
Okay, location first. The material places it firmly in the Balkan Peninsula, borders the Adriatic Sea to the south,
Okay.
and then land borders with Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Serbia, Kosovo, and Albania. So, yeah, right in the mix.
Southeast Europe, got it. And the source mentions it's small, about, 13,800 square kilometers?
Yeah.
And very mountainous.
Small area, yes, but vertically, it's dramatic. The text highlights that. Average altitude over 950 meters.
Wow.
And a huge chunk, like 37%, is above 2,000 meters. Relative to its size, it's got one of the biggest altitude gradients on Earth.
That must create some incredible landscapes. The source uses really evocative language, doesn't it? Old granite mountains, limestone,
Yeah.
the Bay of Kotor.
Yeah, and the climate stuff is almost poetic. Midsummer clouds, these aquiline Adriatic shapes.
Right. The low clouds near Olsinj,
Yeah.
snow white sculptures on the peaks, the haze over Podgorica.
And the contrast between like a calm mirror sea and then wild foam flowers crashing on the rocks. Moonlight on Mount Levichen, it paints a picture of a place really shaped by nature.
Okay, so the name Montenegro, Black Mountain.
Yeah, the source confirms it's Slavic, refers to those dark mountain slopes. But what's interesting is the text points out the name wasn't just for one mountain.
Oh.
It grew to cover regions, then the whole country, used by dynasties like the Baluch, Konoyevich, Petrović, and Negotia. It's a name with the sort of grandeur baked in.
Right. Let's rewind the clock then. Your material points way back to Illyrian tribes in the early Iron Age.
That's where the source starts, yeah. Illyrians.
What does it say about them? Were they developed?
Surprisingly so for the time, building fortified cities, burial mounds. The text mentions construction systems that suggest, decent craftsmanship and social order.
Okay. And then the Greeks came onto the scene.
Around the 3rd century BC, yeah. Spreading from the coast, founding colonies, trading ports on the Adriatic, think places like Epidaurus, Ragusium.
Which became Dubrovnik later. Right.
Exactly. And Dyrrhachium. These places spurred more town building.
Followed by the Romans. Standard pattern almost.
Pretty much. The area got incorporated into provinces, Dalmatia and Prevalis, and the Romans did what Romans do. Infrastructure. Roads, trails, connecting things for traffic and goods. It brought more administrative unity.
And that unity started to shift with the end of the empire, especially with Christianity spreading.
The text really emphasizes this. Christian faith helped sort of re-glue the state and religious order, and it's when history starts getting written down more formally, in church and monastery records.
Before that, pagan inhabitants.
Mostly, yeah. Christianity came in over time, often through Greek influence, Greek followers. Churches were built later.
And there's a specific mention, churches of the Holy Archangels at Kronovich.
Yes, the source highlights those. Says they're documented as early as 1252 to 1257.
Okay, moving into the medieval period. The arrival of the Slavs, 7th century. Big shift for identity.
Huge shift. Resulted in a mixed population, gradually a feudal system developing, and the source talks about the formation of zoops.
Zoops.
Yeah, like hereditary districts. They became really fundamental administrative units.
And the Byzantine Empire. How did they fit in?
Well, initially the relationship with the South Slavs was pretty peaceful, but that changed late 9th century. Byzantium got more involved politically.
Which sets the stage for figures like Prince Kniaz Peter I. The source says he challenged Byzantine authority.
He did. Tried to play in the bigger European power game. Even had aspirations, it seems, for uniting Serbian, Croatian, Albanian populations.
Yeah.
Put the region right in the middle of clashes, including with the Franks.
So when the Croatian kingdom formed and converted to Catholicism, that must have impacted Byzantium's position.
Weakened it, yeah. Though the text does say Byzantine power was partially restored later in some zoops with help from Duke Boki's forces.
And this allowed for Slavic bishops.
It did. though the source is a bit dismissive, calling their writings monuments of too late and undeveloped medieval literature. Ouch.
Yeah.
And this Byzantine pushback happened alongside Christianization efforts by Bulgarian czars like Boris Mihail.
The church hierarchy sounds complicated. Slavic bishops versus Catholic ones?
It seems so. The source mentions Slavonic bishops existed, but only names one, Nepal, and sort of vaguely connects them to Lika. Contrast that with Catholic figures. Knyaz Petar I apparently ruled for about 40 years without much interference.
But ultimately under whose jurisdiction?
Archdiocese of Zadar, according to the text.
And the source mentions differing historical takes on that Zadar connection.
Yeah, Croatian authors, Montenegrin authors, Western archives, different angles. What the text finds noteworthy is how the rise of this new Montenegrin see seemed to cheer up the Serbian royal dynasty, partly because of some kind of split within the Latin archbishopric in Zadar itself.
Okay, let's shift gears. A major challenge arrives, the Ottoman Empire, starting around the 1430s.
Right, and their expansion was incredibly fast. Took Constantinople 1453, pushed deep into the Balkans. By the 1500s, they controlled vast territories.
But Montenegro, the source really highlights this, was notably late in falling completely under Ottoman rule. That seems key.
It is key, several reasons given. A perception may be that Albania and Bosnia were weaker points for them. The reconstruction of a fort, Montefiore, in 1442 gave a boost. And importantly, the tribes developing more autonomy.
The tribes again. They seem central to this resistance.
Absolutely. The source describes them sheltering Serbs fleeing the Ottomans. They built their own kind of polity based on customary rights over their lands, their mountain strongholds like Zupa and Ostrog. And this tribal structure got stronger through migration and intermarriage.
So by the late 15th century, Montenegro is bigger territorially, but still seen as undeveloped.
About 1,000 square kilometers, the source says. And, yeah, undeveloped. Also, the political vacuum to the west helped Hungarian feudalism declining, a key figure Stephen Vucic dying. Towns like Kotor, helped by Venice, became magnets for these mountaineers, landless warriors.
And then the Ottomans just crushed them earlier.
The source suggests the Ottomans had their own internal issues, and outside help for Montenegro got cut off, limited their immediate actions.
There's a really interesting note about a desire for direct submission to Constantinople. Seems counterintuitive.
It does. The text links this to figures like Nego and a vision of independence tied to getting a king title, but it also contrasts this mid-15th century Montenegro, free but primitive, with the big developed European empires. It seems the Ottoman strategy here was maybe the path of least resistance, similar to how they handled Serbian princes. Keep the vital ports separate. Don't force a massive confrontation in the mountains immediately.
Okay, so after Stephen Vucic's death and Catholicism declining, the source mentions Serbian kings trying to reassert orthodoxy in state structures.
Right, and this really brings the Petrović Dynasty into sharp focus.
St. Peter Petrović.
Yes, representing the dynasty. He was given a high church position, archbishop, which was important for regional connections, trade routes like in Zvic.
And later, Stephen Petrović, mid-18th century. He sounds like a fighter.
The source portrays him that way. Crusaded wars against Venetians, Turks, building defenses, water castles, churches, strong walls.
The text describes some pretty intense conflict back then.
Oh, yeah. Allied Ottoman-Venetian campaigns, liberating Epidaurus, but with bloodshed, military building, retaliation against merchants, forced conversions. It sounds brutal. Even mentions a brief period of serfdom after Stephen died and various specific clashes.
So Peter Petrović, arriving as Metropolitan of Cetinje Monastery in 1784, that's framed as a real turning point.
Definitely. Marks the start of the Petrović Dynasty's long rule, about 160 years.
But it wasn't smooth sailing from the start.
No, peace was short-lived. The source says the Turks tried to take Cetinje in 1785, but met strong resistance. Peter I quickly became prince and started trying to pacify the country internally.
What were his first big moves?
Signing a new constitution, trying to unify Orthodox and Muslim citizens. Though by 1796, there's an agreement with the Sultan, but it stipulated Montenegro couldn't hold military authority posts.
Okay, so the Petrović era continues. State building, dealing with Europe. The Skupština Assembly gained power.
Yes, that National Assembly-type body, especially in foreign policy. But Peter I was defiant toward the Sultan. The source says he was building fortresses and building bridges with Russia, practically asking for a declaration of war.
Which eventually came in 1800?
Yeah, the Ottomans invaded. But despite having way more forces, the text notes Turkish generals kind of balked, and the Montenegrins went back to fighting.
And this local fight even reached the international stage?
Remarkably, yeah. The Napoleonic Commission in Paris, 1811, the source says they put pressure on the Sultan, basically an ultimatum, and Ottoman rule in Montenegro, or face a wider war.
Wow. Peter's first night in 1830 didn't see that fully play out.
Right. His successor, Knar II, Petrović Dynasty, the source calls him, worked to make his own mark. And Montenegro started gaining a better standing in European courts compared to other emerging Balkan states.
And got its first major European political nod.
That's how the source frames it. 1831, a British MP presents Montenegro to the House of Commons, seen as the first real political legitimization from a major European power. Other events mention, like French involvement, Tsar Nicholas pushing the Sultan for independence.
So the Petrović Dynasty really boosted Montenegro's international profile during this period.
Absolutely. They put it on the map, so to speak.
All right, staying with the Petrović era, the source talks about growing external pressures.
Right.
Venice, Ottomans, Habsburgs, all threatening autonomy.
Constantly. A precarious position. And Prince Bishop Peter II Petrović Ngosha had this idea in 1783 for united exarchates.
What was that exactly?
Basically led by Serbian Orthodox bishops and political figures, aiming to get senators appointed for reforms within the Ottoman Empire.
How did the Ottomans take that?
As a declaration of war, pretty much. Understandably hostile.
And at the same time, Montenegro asked Russia for military help.
Yes, a mission went out in 1785. Russia, under Catherine II, is actually considering military action against the Ottomans in the Balkans.
But it didn't happen.
Catherine died. Policy shifted to be more cautious. The Russo-Turkish War ended in 1792 with no border changes.
So the lesson learned was?
Montenegro needed to rely on itself more. Strengthen internal and external security. That's what the source emphasizes.
Which spurred the development of their own legislative assemblies.
Right. The first one was called way back in 1736 by Prince Bishop Radonja VII Petrović. Included reps and priests for big decisions. Then, after getting some independence from Venice, they decided to hold them every 2 years.
But there was a power imbalance.
The source points that out. Military commanders appointed by the Prince Bishop had a lot of control, limiting objections. There was also an attempt to create an advisor role, like senators maybe drawing on foreign models involving key noble families.
Efforts to beef up the assembly's power came later.
Yeah, from 1780 onwards, trying to give it more teeth, regular sessions. Then came the idea for an 18-member Senate with different powers based on a foreign model. In 1787, an assembly with priests met alongside the legislative one, kind of establishing a second body.
The 1796 assembly appointed advisors, but the source questions if it was a totally new institution.
Right. The key takeaway, according to the source, is that by 1798, Montenegro had achieved the kind of independence it wanted, but crucially, without that strict separation of powers you might see elsewhere.
Okay, the 19th century. This is framed as a time of rising Montenegrin national consciousness, right? And continued struggle against the Ottomans.
Definitely. And Russia's role was changing. First, supporting Montenegro to check the Ottomans, almost like a vassal. But then that shifted.
Leading to Montenegro declaring war on the Turks in summer 1876.
Yeah, coordinating with other Balkan allies, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, they all attacked around the same time.
And Montenegro had some big military wins.
Huge ones, according to the source. Seized Huma and Plav, liberated Nutoric in September 76, took the capital of Dukagjin after an 11-day siege in October. Later captured Bar and Skadar too.
Which led to massive territorial expansion, from 11,000 to 42,000 square kilometers.
That's the figure given. Which, naturally, got the attention of the great European powers. Led to the Congress of Berlin.
And Montenegro attended as a recognized state for the first time.
Yep, making demands. The source describes this emergence quite poetically. Love of freedom, pride, the fight of the Duke of the Black Mountain.
But it also adds a layer about how history gets written.
Yeah, it talks about the historical canon being shaped by both the vanquished and the national pride of the victors. It's quite nuanced.
So history became a tool for nation building.
Absolutely. The source says events were framed through a Montenegrin lens, writing used to affirm this identity in the Balkans. Songs, epics, all crucial for shaping historical consciousness after the Ottomans.
Creating a potentially complex national image.
Exactly. The source highlights this dual image in the mid-19th century, the proud victor nation, but also the sort of European garden, embarrassed by things like blood revenge, captures that internal tension.
Right. The source also brings in context about Ottoman reforms in the later 19th century, after Damascus fell, described as the collapse of Islam's last bulwark. Dramatic stuff.
Very dramatic phrasing. But yeah, a period of reform followed disorder, despite official jihads and interventions earlier.
But these reforms didn't create real equality.
Not entirely. The source points out, for example, only Christian subjects could complain about domestic suppression. Muslims couldn't formally complain about unjust treatment. Still, things like confirming equality for Christians in 1856 did lay some groundwork for independence movements.
Back in Montenegro, Prince Danilo succeeded Peter II.
And the source says Montenegro cleverly used the Russian-Ottoman War to gain territory, like Nikic under Karl Chanillo. But the Berlin Congress stopped further expansion then.
And Montenegrins didn't feel bound by losses in Bosnia.
That's a specific point made. The source also talks about a Serbian armed rebellion against Turkey happening while the great powers were distracted. This led to Russian intervention and Belgrade stepping in with support.
Which brings us back to the 1876 war declared by Serbia and Montenegro.
Right. Though the source notes Russia wasn't overly enthusiastic at first, it also suggests Serbia's actions were sometimes seen as provocative, given how close they were to independent Montenegro. Prince Alexander II's diplomacy is mentioned as maybe a bit weak in protecting Adriatic security.
The whole independence struggle is framed as the final phase for South Slavs, including Serbs, against the Ottomans in the Balkans.
Yes, emphasizing Montenegro's key role, alongside other Serbian states like the Principality of Serbia. Prince Michael of Serbia gets a lot of credit. Courageous, tireless, liberating land, pushing towards Kosovo. His life portrayed as a sacrifice for Serbian freedom, enlarging Serbia but leaving the job unfinished.
There's mention of an Ottoman decree, a firman, in 1860.
Yeah, the source says it basically appropriated the province of Montenegro for the Sultan. Montenegrins, feeling the impact of Serb suffering under Ottoman rule described as barbaric pomposity or incensed,
Which fueled conflicts like the 1861 war.
declared on the merciful Sultan. Yeah, taking advantage of Montenegrin support. The text calls it the War of Mountaineers and Turks, driven by a desire for revenge. But it notes the revenge wasn't fully realized. Montenegro remained under Turkish influence, and bloodshed continued elsewhere.
Russia's role seems complicated, sometimes hesitant.
The source suggests Russia, balancing its own interests with the plight of Slav Serbs, tried early in the 19th century to plan for Ottoman expulsion, seeking allies. But it got delayed. National uprisings started without direct Russian help when Turkish troops moved out. The source dates these: Serbia, 1804, Montenegro, 1858.
Ottoman power really started crumbling around 1900.
Leading to the liberation of Kosovo and Metohija, Serbia gaining rights there in 1913. Serbia entered WWI fearing they'd lose those games due to Austria-Hungary and Russia maybe pulling back. WWI's outcome with allied U.S. help is framed as the historic chance for Serbs to unite in one state. Serbia fought the Central Powers till the end, and the Yugoslav question was huge at the 1919 Paris Conference.
But before WWI, there was the Second Balkan War in June 1913.
Right. The source explains this was sparked by Bulgaria turning against its former allies, Serbia and Greece. Bulgaria was unhappy with how territory was divided after the First War. Their big mistake, the text argues, was fighting fellow South Slavs instead of the Ottomans.
So Bulgaria attacked first.
Preemptively, yeah, a rapid assault on the Macedonian front, but it backfired badly. Battles like Kumanovo in July 1913 led to a quick, devastating defeat for Bulgaria,
Forcing them to retreat.
reluctantly leaving liberated lands. Serbia and Greece then teamed up with a treaty and joint offensive. Bulgaria's swift collapse really shook up the region and the new states' plans. The great powers, especially Russia, tried to mediate, but it failed. War escalated.
Then World War I hits. And the source says it was particularly devastating for Montenegro.
More tragically than any other theater of actions is the quote. They declared war on Austria-Hungary very early, July 28, 1914.
King Nicholas took personal command.
He did. But involvement on the Serbian and Italian fronts is called disastrous. They were unprepared, outnumbered, quickly pushed out of northern Albania, then right across Montenegro itself.
Leading to their leadership being captured.
Yeah, an Austro-Hungarian unit captured the king, the PM, top military commanders. The source actually credits the Serbian high command with saving Montenegrin units and the state from collapsing completely.
Both governments ended up in exile.
Serbia moved to Corfu early 1916. Montenegro's assembly and King Nicholas fled to London. A provisional government was set up in Corfu, French-influenced, with plans for Montenegro to host a future Allied conference on liberating Serbia.
Allied troops eventually landed on the coast.
About a month later, yeah, around 30,000 men, French divisions, other allies pushed towards Nikic. Another force came from the west.
But General Naja faced tough resistance.
Fierce opposition, yeah. Chasing across the mountains, the Austrians apparently expected the attack and had brought up extra artillery.
And the war's end brought the formation of the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes.
December 1st, 1918, proclaimed in Belgrade, united and indissoluble, ruled by the Serbian Petrović Dynasty from Belgrade.
Territory from former Austria-Hungary and Serbia, which meant border disputes. 6 countries.
Hungary, Austria, Bulgaria, Albania, Italy, Romania. Big mix demographically, too, though over 86% Serbs, Croats, Slovenes called Yugoslavs.
Official name: Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes.
Or Kraljevina Srba, Hrvata I Slovenaca. Government met in old Serbian territory, later Belgrade. Areas outside Serbia initially under military governors. Border disputes, especially with Greece and Italy, were a huge early problem.
And Montenegro's own territory was affected by these shifts.
Yeah, the source notes Tirani and nearby areas, plus regions south of Podgorica, went to Albania. And crucially, the Montenegrin authorities themselves accepted the Croatian-Slavonian parliament's decision in November 1918 to annex Montenegro into this new kingdom.
Right, moving towards World War II. French influence in Yugoslavia weakened around 1939, pressure building.
That's what the source indicates. Italy's actions, like forcing Hitler's envoy to Belgrade, happened in that context of inevitable wider war.
Yugoslavia tried diplomacy, opening lots of offices abroad.
They did, but the source claims Serbia's status didn't really change. The inherent weakness of the state was exposed by the war, huge losses, reversing earlier gains.
And peace treaties didn't solve the underlying problems. More unrest followed.
The source argues the fate of defeated empires wasn't really settled, fueling revolutions. Axis victories basically forced the kingdom's hand to negotiate to survive, join Germany's sphere.
The attack itself had a unifying effect, though. Encouraged national unification.
It seems so, according to the source. Enlightened popular awareness. Nationalist governments fled into exile, fearing oppression. Meanwhile, pro-communist ideas found fertile ground among the poor, who feared losing rights.
There's mention of a conspiracy.
An attempt to reform the party towards broader socialism, economic independence, mobilizing the peasant majority. An ultimatum about citizenship analysis apparently worsened relations with England. The source suggests people expected a power seizure because the rulers seemed indecisive, chaotic.
So seeking treaties with the winners became essential.
Necessary for political settlement, the source says. Before summer, the National Liberation Movement, NLM, organized forces corps, armies, a general HQ to resist. The Communist Party, underground, was ready to counter the official settlement. ZVNOH adopted a strategy for immediate partisan fighting.
The source highlights the value of Yugoslav memoirs and chronicles for history.
But adds they should not be discussed in public, which is quite a statement. It also lists other details from the period. Celebrations, draft laws, private archives showing some Axis cooperation, partisan trials, Socialist Academy directives, the rising cost of peace.
And after the war, the shift to socialist Yugoslavia.
Montenegro became a constituent republic November 29, 1945, part of the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia. The source describes the regime for the next 20 years as a fragile coalition, centralist communists versus decentralist nationalist factions.
Tito held huge power.
Paramount powers, the source says, at the expense of federal bodies. A Serbian faction under Milan Stojadinović was purged.
And Serbia's protective role towards Montenegro changed.
The text suggests that protection shifted from Serbia itself to the centralist factions within the Communist Party. The 1946 constitution made Montenegro a people's republic, alongside Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia. Bosnia-Herzegovina and Macedonia were designated autonomous provinces within Serbia.
That setup seems like it created immediate tensions.
Definitely. The source highlights this imbalance. Slovenia, Croatia, Serbia seen as quasi-national, while the others, including Montenegro, had less than full status.
And Serbia had a unique burden within this structure.
Despite its size, having large populations of the other republics within its borders gave it what the source calls a second-class status as a people's republic. Montenegro had a similar issue, being paired with this greater Serbia.
How did Montenegro react?
According to the source, they tried to fix it by formally severing their historic connection with Serbia in 1946. A reminder that after WWI, they'd been administratively joined.
And cracking down hard on Montenegro nationalism had another side effect.
Yeah, it created a split in language use, driving a wedge between Montenegrin and Serbian national language identity. People complied initially with the new order, but grievances mounted fast.
The post-1945 period is described as coercive centralism.
A stark picture in the source. More government power, monopoly on violence, crushing local party cells, losing touch with the people. The sacrifices that fueled the movement were all but forgotten.
Leading to a deep sense of injustice.
Absolutely. The text says any perceived legal breach by an official felt like a personal assault on national dignity, breeding resentment.
How did people express this unhappiness?
Either loudly through dramatic media or quietly through gossip, as the source puts it.
The import-export description in the source is pretty blunt.
It is. Says the new order imported to Montenegro all of Serbian culture, fierce social turmoil and misery, while exporting its traditional dignities and sunny skies.
And this discontent was widespread.
Almost unanimous, according to the source, the official response. A desperate attempt to oppress it, intensifying legal actions, which just generated more complaints. More than 300 problems were reported, the text claims.
Right, in this widespread discontent, these tensions, they obviously fed into the eventual breakup of Yugoslavia.
The source marks 1991 as the beginning of the end. Croatia, Slovenia, Macedonia declaring independence.
And the reaction was brutal.
Immediate and brutal revenge, the source says. Mentions Serbian tanks bombing Vukovar and Osijek in spring '92.
The siege of Dubrovnik is specifically highlighted.
Yeah, called a barbaric siege operation. And Vukovar's siege became a symbol of the Holocaust. Then the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina starts in '92. And the source states Serbian, and later Montenegrin, units committed massacres of Bosniaks.
The conflict eventually wound down due to international pressure.
A ceasefire in '94, then a peace agreement, though fighting continued. NATO intervention in September '95 finally ended it. The source sees this whole period as the end of a lengthy and painful process of dissolution that really started back in WWI.
What happened to Montenegro immediately after the breakup?
It stayed with Serbia in a successor state for about a year, but the source notes a major political shift in 1996.
The Milicevic government faced big protests.
His restrictive rule sparked large protests, yeah. But the opposition couldn't get enough widespread support. There was a moment in '99, the source says, where a repeat of Vukovar seemed possible, but serious riots were avoided.
The key development involved an opposition leader becoming prime minister.
Yes, the most prominent one. The source attributes this to international pressure.
And this set Montenegro on the path to full independence.
Sovereignty increased gradually. The big moment was June 3, 2006, when the Montenegrin Federation constitutionally accepted Montenegro's independence, dissolving the union with Serbia.
Followed quickly by international recognition.
June 15th, recognized by the UN and the EU, a historic milestone of self-determination, as the source puts it.
Okay, looking at Montenegro today, post-independence, the source analyzes its politics, foreign policy. Up to 2020, relations were mostly open.
Or at least not overtly hostile, yeah. But there were shifts. Mass protests raised doubts about the Euro-Atlantic path, leading the regime to take a meandering line.
International relations became a tool for the regime's survival.
That's the source's argument. Operating outside normal diplomacy, not primarily for the country's benefit, a clear line drawn between friends and enemies.
NATO was emphasized heavily.
Seen as vital for survival and for the regime's position, framed as defense against Serbian re-expansion. NATO membership also acted as a garb, shielding internal affairs from scrutiny, according to the source.
Key allies, US, UK, then some Central European states.
This clear division let the regime leverage immunity, maintain high-level contacts. But the downside, the source argues, was allies turning a blind eye to internal issues like lack of pluralism, hurting Montenegro's reputation.
The actual practice of foreign policy. The source sounds a bit cynical.
Calls policies often thoughtless and unimaginative. Building relations became routine, using tricks to entertain visiting delegations to buy time domestically. Not many significant outcomes noted.
Public communication was also performative.
Countries not cooperating were noisily condemned. Diplomacy presented as a public show, ambassador visits expressing displeasure, long press statements, but often no real action followed at the top levels.
Meanwhile, they pursued EU integration.
After earlier failed attempts since 2000, they went for full membership in 2010. Rapid integration sought. Applied for NATO in 2008, joined 2017.
Recent politics saw a major shift in 2020.
Right? 2016 elections were disputed, coalition held for 4 years. Then August 2020, the opposition won a narrow majority. Peaceful transition. Djukanovic forming a coalition in July 2020 amidst allegations is also mentioned.
Relations with Serbia and the Serbian Orthodox Church worsened.
Significantly deteriorated, expected to stay tense. The post-August 2020 era marks a big government shift, revisiting old treaties like Venice and Pirin, now claiming they fit national interests.
A new institution was set up in Podgorica.
The Union of European and Euro-Atlantic States aimed to link development to the international community. But the source is critical, saying it was severely harmed by accepting the Union experience.
EU talks might restart, but problems remain.
Rule of law disputes likely unresolved, though the source credits Montenegro with contributing to European political maturity despite these issues. The new majority needs to align state interests.
But achieving consensus is hard now.
The source suggests fundamental differences in state interests make simple roadmaps futile, and warns a return to authoritarianism would breed disillusionment.
Identity. A really complex and contested area. The source details how history gets used politically, like the 2005 centennial celebrations.
Yeah, a big dispute between Belgrade and Podgorica over pre-WWI statehood history.
Accusations flying both ways.
Serbian PM accusing Montenegro of distorting history for politics, maligning royalist Serbs. Montenegrin PM accusing Serbia of denying Montenegro's long statehood.
So history became a political football.
An asset for elites in their rivalry over Montenegro's destiny, the source says, used to grab public attention.
Did EU integration change how history was used?
It provided a new frame. The focus shifted from stressing a shared Serbian past to endorsing Montenegro's independence as the natural goal. The ruling party dropped its earlier Yugoslavism.
So the idea of a distinct, self-determined Montenegrin identity took center stage.
Exactly. Framed as benefiting most citizens, emphasizing a unique path separate from the shared Yugoslav framework. This narrative dominated for about a decade.
Reinterpreting past rulers to fit this narrative.
Yes, using historical figures and stories to bolster the case for statehood and European integration, rulers once seen differently were now recalled to emphasize the Kingdom of Montenegro's history, its European tradition.
Even the 10th independence anniversary focused on monarchs, chronicles, folk songs.
The goal, per the source, was to stress Montenegro's historical worth, its antiquity, make it seem more European than even its neighbors, cultivating an image of the genre Montenegrin nature keepers, traditional, hospitable, but also quarrelsome, drawing on the past.
And the tribal heritage is deeply tied into this.
Crucially, the source notes early Montenegrins identified more by tribe Pishika Radonjica than a state name. Piperhead comes from a tribal name.
That tribal model defined community.
Based on kinship, common ancestors, strong ties to territory. Affirmed through shared names, customary law, rituals, myths. Terms like Prija, Stari, Kumshita, Rojak were key social connectors.
So before Montenegrin, people were Negojevci or Vrigovicani first.
Primarily, yes. Montenegrin was often used informally, sometimes dismissively, beyond the mountains, even rabble of the south.
The source clarifies those terms.
Mountains could mean places like Vilnius, Pajar, Herzegovina, striped shirts for Croats, Bosniaks, Serbs. Rabble of the south, often an epithet for Montenegrins.
Negative perceptions from other regions existed.
Severe considerations of a Montenegrin nature from the north, ridicule. The text links Vuk Karadzic's work on language partly to saving the poor and naked tongue of a tribe. So the Montenegrin tongue identity emerged from the margins of a Serb nation, becoming distinct through persistence.
Okay, let's switch to the economy. Tourism, environment. This source mentions some grand labels used in the past.
Oh yeah, Balkan Eldorado, New Swiss Alps, New Nice, or Dubrovnik. A lot of hype based on supposedly superior natural conditions.
Citing advantages like scenery, Danube connection, big trees.
Exactly. Blue and green scenery, Danube cradle, origin of huge forest trees.
But under socialism, this didn't quite translate into prosperity.
The source suggests the socialist model, trying to equalize the unequal, didn't let these benefits fully shine, even in tourism.
And today, still potential, but problems.
The source notes that despite having beauty comparable to Kotor Bay, Montenegro ranks only 14th in tourism revenue investment. Border and environmental issues are real problems.
A hidden competition advantage is mentioned, though.
Yeah, being on the international radar transformed things after initial efforts, may be seen now in foreign money buying coastal land.
They've won some awards, too.
Best cruise destination, and that interesting one, Wimbledon Cup of Athleisure Danica, whatever that means.
But the source sees a core problem with development strategy.
Says the nature of innovative mechanisms, which need clear goals, has perished.
It lists potential and serious problems in tourism.
Potential, market rise, developing the hinterland, joint marketing with neighbors. Problems, heavy reliance on foreign investors. Seasonality, Too much focus on summer beaches, sustainability issues, monostructured economy, growing regional disparities.
The source suggests shifting the focus.
Yeah, systematic development in other areas, volcano destinations, peripheral regions, not just the coast.
Tourism is clearly the key sector, though.
Absolutely. About 85% of visits revenue from coastal beaches, despite huge potential for year-round mountain tourism.
And tourism impacts more than just the economy.
It can shape conservation, urban planning, settlement systems. Management happens at state, regional, local levels.
But planning and coordination are weak points.
Failure to link tourism plans with wider spatial planning, lack of stakeholder coordination. But there's an opportunity to integrate natural areas with civil society partnerships.
Montenegro has rich bioresources, too. Medicinal plants.
Lots of variety, wild and cultivated. Health wellness tourism is seen as a rising niche, combining medicinal resources, rural settings, cultural heritage. Plans for thermal springs in Vela Pavlić mentioned.
Other potential areas.
Wine, high-quality ham cheese, forests, organic farming, extraordinary potential, the source says. Some small-scale wine tourism and eco-villages already exist.
But despite the beauty, serious environmental challenges remain.
Majestic, yes, but not immune. Ecological problems often worsened by social issues. Illegal settlement, land clearance, property disputes, infrastructure, logging, abusing biodiversity.
Existing protection programs aren't enough.
Source calls them inadequate, management incompetent. National programs might be accepted socially, but can lead to areas being cordoned off from life, creating a sense that any use is bad.
The idea of duplicated ecoregions sounds complex.
The source sees it more as reflecting current power structures than a practical plan, likely soon. It roughly matches water-energy divisions.
But more action needed for managers.
More intensive, better coordinated action. It's tough, lots of species habitats, but also economic demographic pressures, political interests affecting land use.
Protecting biodiversity needs local focus.
Better structure and support at subnational local levels. Solutions suggested. Better education, communication, coordination, support systems based on real experience, not just theory.
Environmental decision-making is hard.
Complex decisions are possible, even in small institutions, but it needs much better and selected intelligence and energy than in typical regimes, says the source. Meeting social demands is tough under top-down management.
And official documents sometimes get ignored.
In new environments, documents might exist but are publicly disregarded. Principles stated, then checked later, only to justify neo-utilitarian interests, especially when linked to abstract global concerns. Meaningful results might take a decade, focusing on current connections.
Let's touch on education and social development briefly. System seems well-developed, but undergoing changes.
Yes. Elementary is compulsory, free. Ministry ensures standards. Private schools exist, smaller scale. Grammar schools are 4 years, vocational 3 to 5 years.
Higher education has evolved.
In lumps, the source says. Maine State University restructured in 2004. Another institution became independent 2003. Some programs require students to transfer. Colleges exist. Dorms for secondary students.
Original goal was equality of opportunity.
Education for all, regardless of origin. Social development includes a state market commission for social care issues, foster care, housing, sanctions, personnel trained in colleges. Teacher education is continually reformed.
Okay, looking towards future prospects, the source circles back to that desire for independence growing after 1981.
Fueled by Croatian nationalism and demands for self-rule in the Federation.
Montenegrin leaders stoked national feeling against Serbs.
Blamed them for economic problems, according to the source. Identity fostered by lionizing historical figures, claiming distinct history culture, arguing Montenegro deserved republic status.
Ethnic identity was key here.
Especially significant for defining this young Montenegrin identity, restoring the cathedral church mentioned as expressing religious separation from Serbs. After recent elections, Serbia's involvement in domestic issues intensified,
Leading to more discontent.
linked in the source to falling real estate values, poorer social services, dissatisfaction with the perceived Serbian-centric government. Montenegro was a main supporter of the formal peace process.
And this ultimately led to the independence referendum.
After talks, lack of progress, they offered a referendum, regulated by a prior agreement for peaceful democratization, ensuring legitimacy.
The question itself was standard.
Unambiguous. Source muses independent state might have been simpler than nation state, but Montenegro's state could cause disputes.
Requirements for independence included borders and alliances.
Guaranteeing borders with neighbors, alliances with Arab North African nations, non-Western nations actively promoted as potential anti-terrorism partners.
Wow, what an incredible journey through the layers of Montenegro's story. We've covered its stunning geography, its deep historical roots and struggles for statehood, the complexities of its identity, and the challenges it faces today, from politics to the environment.
And it's crucial to remember all of this understanding comes directly from the source material you provided. It really does paint a picture of a place with, breathtaking natural beauty, but layered with this incredibly turbulent history and these ongoing debates about its essence and future.
Absolutely. And the conclusion of the text uses some strong words, describing Montenegro's politics and history as unforgiving, seemingly clumsy, unfeeling, and incapable of human emotion. It's quite a stark characterization, but it's there in your source.
It is.
So considering that deep, often difficult past described in the material, how essential might understanding that perspective be for navigating the country's path forward? Especially with its desire for European integration and, while managing the expectations of visitors who might only see that idyllic image.
That's the crucial question it leaves us with, isn't it? For you, the listener. What does this striking contrast highlighted in the source, the idyllic beauty, versus the described reality of its history and politics, what does that tell you about the specific, maybe even universal challenges that small nations face, as they assert their identity and try to find their place in a really complex world? Something to think about.